All right, so I gave y'all some homework. Oh, I forgot. The dog ate it. Okay, something to think about was the question of how widespread were the effects of the plagues. And we asked the question, was this across all the land of Egypt, which included Goshen, or were they immune from everything? From all of them? That's what you call hedging your bet. Warren is actually right. The answer is yes and no. So we're going to actually get into that a little bit. So the question was, did all the plagues affect the Israelites? Did any of them? You have tonight's? No, I don't have. Okay. You need one or two? So we're finishing up lesson 4, and we're going to be moving into 5 tonight, Lord willing. Go ahead. Okay, so lesson 10, or plague 10, I'm sorry. So the 10th would have, certainly, if they weren't obedient to what they were instructed. But what about the 1 through 9? Okay. Okay. Did the plague itself affect them? Okay. So did you do your homework? That's what I'm talking about. He's right. The first time it's mentioned of whether or not the Israelites were immune is the plague of flies. And there's certain ones that it says they would not affect Goshen, and other ones that would affect. That it doesn't say. So we'll continue to take a look at that as we move forward. So we finished up with the first plague is what we did, the plague of blood. So we finished up the river plagues. I don't believe we got into the plague of frogs. So we're picking up at Exodus chapter 8, verses 1 through 7. So let's read that scripture. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, Thus says the Lord, let my people go, that they may serve me. But if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite your whole territory with frogs. And the Nile will swarm with frogs, which will come up and go into your home or your house, and into your bedroom, and on your bed, and into the houses of your servants, and on your people, and into your ovens, and into your kneading bowls. So the frogs will come upon you, and your people, and all your servants." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the rivers, over the streams, and over the pools, and make frogs come up out of the land of Egypt." So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. And the magicians did the same with their secret arts, making frogs come up on the land of Egypt. Now I want to read you something tonight that I found on the internet. So this was a news story, November 13th, 2019, out of Fresno, California. And I won't mess with you too much. There is a Christian satire site called the Babylon Bee. Are any of you familiar with that? Okay, good. Well, anyway, it's satire. So here's the satire. The headline reads, "Chick-fil-A employee throws down staff, which turns into snake-eating Popeye's false serpents." Are you guys familiar with the Chick-fil-A Popeyes thing going on right now? Here's the beginning of the article. In a meager attempt to establish his restaurant as the chicken sandwich powerhouse, a Popeyes manager went into a nearby Chick-fil-A and cast down 2 staffs, which allegedly transformed it into vipers before a mildly amused Chick-fil-A manager. However, witnesses claim Popeyes shouted, "Hey, what's over there?" before pulling the actual snake from their robes and tossing them onto the floor. In prophetic retaliation, the Chick-fil-A manager threw down his rod, which became a larger serpent, devouring the other 2 while gagging, a common reaction to eating anything from Popeyes. Arms spread to the awed patrons, the Chick-fil-A manager proclaimed, "Let not your hearts be hardened like unto how tough Popeye's chicken is. For what is that stuff they slather under their tenders? Old Rice Krispies or something." Anyway, I thought since we've been in the middle of that, I would share that with you. That's funny. My favorite part of that's when he said, "Hey, what's that over there?" And then throws, it's implying like the magic arts of the magicians. Oh, was that right? Oh, I'll be. Well, mind your manners or else. Okay. So, we're at the bottom of page 6 in our notes. In this, no, we're not. We're still on the plague of frogs. I'm wanting to move along. So, again, Moses confronted Pharaoh with a demand for freedom and a threat. He would make the land swarm with frogs. During the plague of frogs, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron for the first time. So, now, during the plague, he calls for Moses and Aaron to come. He would allow the Israelites to go offer sacrifices if the frogs were removed. So that comes along here in verse 8. Then Pharaoh called to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Entreat the Lord that he will remove the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go that they may sacrifice to the Lord." And Moses said to Pharaoh, the honor is yours to tell me, when shall I entreat for you and your servants and your people, that the frogs be destroyed from you and your houses, that they may be left only in the Nile. Then he said, tomorrow. So he said, may it be according to your word, that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. And the frogs will depart from you and your houses and your servants and your people, and they will be left only in the Nile. Then Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried to the Lord concerning the frogs which he had inflicted upon Pharaoh. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses, and the frogs died out of the houses, the courts, and the fields. This would have been pleasant, right? So they piled them in heaps, and the land became foul. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, pay attention to the wording here, he hardened his heart and did not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Now, pay attention to that wording. We're going to come to that a little bit later. So Moses and Aaron cried out. When Pharaoh saw that the land had relief, he hardened his heart, just as the Lord had predicted. Now, if you remember, we began talking about the gods of Egypt, which these were in direct opposition. So God is inflicting them essentially with representations of their own gods. So you wouldn't think frogs would be anything worship-worthy, right? Well, the gods of Egypt affected by this plague, the different ways this shows up are in the parentheses, but the primary name is Heket. Now, the frog was considered a theophany of a goddess, the wife of the creator of the world and the goddess of childbirth. So this was the wife of the creator of the world and the goddess of childbirth. Heket was always shown with the head of a frog. Amulets and scarabs worn by women to protect them during childbirth would often bear the image of Heket for protection. So they would have this amulet with the image of a frog on it. They would place them on people, the ladies that were given birth, and that was to protect them. So Heket was believed to assist women in childbirth. Now, consider the irony in this statement that the frogs invaded Pharaoh's bedroom and even jumped on his bed. So the gods of Egypt affected by this plague was primarily Heket. Interesting. Now, I provided something for you in Lesson 5. We're going to look here. I've given you at the end of the actual lesson before the article is a chart of a listing of the gods of Egypt. So you can kind of have a quick reference. Egyptian deities, about their deity, their purpose, or their form or sacred animal. And that's in the middle of Lesson 5. So you'll have that as a reference. So those were the river plagues. And now we're going to be looking at nuisance plagues. In the second pair of plagues, God used tiny blood-sucking insects to make life miserable for the Egyptians. The first of these plagues was announced as if to punish Pharaoh was unannounced as if to punish Pharaoh for revoking his commitment to release the Israelites. The second, the plague of flies, was announced. At the conclusion of this pair of plagues, the haughty Egyptian king explored the possibility of compromise with this adversary, Moses. So let's look at the first one, and if you study these or in your text, you may see different titles when it talks about the plague of insects. And in our notes we have here the plague of lice. Now, it's interesting. The Hebrew word kanim has been translated lice, fleas, gnats, and even mosquitoes. Obviously, some blood-sucking insect is involved. Sounds great, right? Now, this plague was unannounced. Now, we've already made mention of it, but does that seem fair? Why, yes. Okay. Yeah, and we just made reference to that, so I was kind of see if you were paying attention. But yeah, so it's believed that this one was unannounced because he, for the first time, reneged on his promise that he would let them go. And so the magicians tried to imitate this miracle, but they could not. And so if you want to read in detail what happened there with the plague of insects, you can look at the details there. Now, let's talk a little bit about the gods of Egypt affected by this plague, primarily one named Geb, the great god of earth and the head of the divine tribunal on the kingship. What else do we know about this? Where'd that go? Yeah, the great god of the earth. Egyptian gave offerings to Geb for the bounty of the soil. He was also the source of fresh waters and ultimately all that the earth produced, so that Geb was directly associated with the fertility of both the earth and livestock. Now, this plague would have been especially dreadful to the priests of Egypt, for they were required to shave their hair off every day and wear a single tunic, that no lice would be permitted on their bodies. So, that would be quite miserable for them in their worldview and what they were considering. On top of this, so to this point, do we have anything in the text that indicates that Israel was immune? We don't. Do we have anything in the text to indicate that they weren't? That they were immune? So, can we state with assurance that we know that Israel was in fact subject to this? If they weren't? Yeah, so there's nothing explicit stating one way or the other here with these first three. And it's interesting when we get to the next one, there is something stated that Goshen, and there's a purpose behind it, that Goshen would be left out. Now, so let's go ahead and move on then to the plague of flies. Now, when you first think of this one, and you try to picture what this might be like. If you've ever been harassed at a picnic, you know, the regular old houseflies, they're really annoying, aren't they? I mean, to the point of, I'll tell you all a story. So whether it was a fly or a small fly like a gnat, so one Thursday afternoon during the summer, I had Sherlonda, and we were down at the park there along the river, the new one, the red, white, and blue little park. And she was playing, and there was another lady there, and we got to talking, and she was talking about her granddaughter. And in the process of talking to her and, inviting her to church, I swallowed a fly. So, did I swallow it, or did it go up my nose? It went up my nose. It eventually found its way out through my throat. So I'm trying to have this meaningful conversation. All the while I'm coughing and trying to talk, and I'm like, it was really bad. So that was just one really uncomfortable, annoying fly. But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're actually talking about something more akin to what we would call a horsefly. Now, I've told Sherlonda, I said, I'd rather get stung by a bee than bit by a horsefly. Now, so that's what we're talking about here. Is there's actually, they call them dog flies in that part of the world, and they are vicious. So we're not just talking about house flies here. We're talking about very aggressive biting flies like a horsefly or something that we would be familiar with. So the first round of plagues ended as it had begun, with the freedom demand accompanied by a threat. The next day, swarms of flies would attack the Egyptians, but not Goshen, where the Israelites lived. So let's look at that. So in the verses 20 through 32, and I believe it was, I had written down over here, verses 22 and 23. So verses 22 and 23, but on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people are living, so that no swarms of insects will be there, in order that you may know that I, the Lord, am in the midst of the land. So this is the first indication that Goshen was spared. And I will put a division between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall occur. So this was a further sign, that's the way that I understand it, and as Gary brought out here and Glenn brought to our attention through his studies, that this is the first time we have a clear indication that Goshen would in fact be spared. So Pharaoh, after going through this one, was now ready for compromise. He was willing to allow the Israelites to go sacrifice to God as long as they did it in the land of Egypt. So was that consistent with their original request? What was their original request? 3 days journey into the wilderness to make sacrifices. So he was going to allow it, but within the land. And Moses countered by stating that if they offered sacrifices within the land, that the Egyptian people would be enraged at their sacrifices and cause them harm. Here's why. Sheep were an abomination to the Egyptians. So if you go back and read in Genesis 46:34, so that would be a problem if the Israelites were involving their sacrifices with sheep. But also bulls and heifers were sacred to Egyptians. So if they were doing those sacrifices involving those animals in the middle of the Egyptian people, Moses said it would enrage them. And he said, we won't do it. So Pharaoh offered a second compromise. The Israelites should go into the desert and offer their sacrifice. If they did not go far, Moses interpreted this as the equivalent to the 3-day journey he had been demanding. So he agreed to pray for the cessation of the fourth plague. In answer to Moses' prayer, the flies totally disappeared. But again, flies. I got some good typos for you. The flies totally disappeared. And in verse 32, but Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also, and he did not let the people go. So, the gods of Egypt affected by this plague. The Egyptian gods impacted by this plague are more difficult to identify, This is David Padfield that offers us this research. But here are two possibilities he offers. The main one being Kepri, and those are all the different names that are closely associated that it was known by. And if in Re or Ra. Now, Ra is the way that I'm more familiar with it, the god Ra, the creator, king of the gods, and supreme god. So, the Egyptian gods impacted or more difficult. The Kepri was usually depicted as a scarab or dung beetle, and often pushing a solar disk. Kepri did not have a cult of its own, but was honored in many Egyptian temples. So, deification of the scarab beetle is still seen in Egypt today. Now, Ra is the ancient Egyptian word for, what do you think, the god Ra? Where do they attribute to being the supreme god? Sun. The sun. So Ra, the sole creator, was visible to the people of Egypt as the disk of the sun, but they knew him in many other forms. He could appear as a crowned man, a falcon, or a man with a falcon's head, and as the scarab beetle pushes a round ball of dung in front of it. Now, so the Almighty Supreme God is depicted as a scarab beetle or a dung beetle pushing. I mean, you can make up a lot of stuff, but that one just seems really odd, doesn't it? Really, really odd. Now, because this one was involved with insects and swarms, that would be an affront. Now, for the first time, God made a distinction between his people and the Egyptians. The swarm stayed away from Goshen where his people lived. God made a distinction between his people and the Egyptians. Now, this distinction was in order that they would know that he was the Lord God in the midst of the land. This is important. An important thing that we need to take note of as we move forward. So now, we should be able to move ahead here and begin now with Lesson 5, which picks up with the next set of plagues. So the next 6 plagues are going to be 3 pairs. So the mathematicians, that would be 4 plus 3 times 2 is 6, right? So that gives us 10. All right, any questions about those? Anything from Lesson 4 before we move on to Lesson 5? It's all pretty standard stuff, with the one distinction being that the plague there, the biting flies, was set at Goshen was set apart from that one. Not yet. Was that in our text yet? We were going to, but so far, what's it said about Pharaoh? He. Okay. So I've got some good stuff for you tonight on that, because we've not come to that phrase yet, but we will. Got some good stuff for you, because this is a very important thing for us to understand. And we'll come to that, and we'll talk about why it's important for us to understand what's being said. So I'm hoping that's where we end tonight, is on an article that I provided you. So, conflict with Egypt. The river plagues and nuisance plagues were followed in turn by 6 additional plagues. These may be viewed in 3 pairs: the disease plagues, the destruction plagues, and the darkness plagues. Though Pharaoh continued to renege on promises to free the Israelites, some movement on his part is observable throughout the contest. During the plague of frogs, he had asked Moses to pray to Yahweh to have the plague removed. And after the plague of flies, the Egyptian offered 2 compromises to Moses. Yet more compromise followed during the last 6 plagues. So there is some movement in Pharaoh, but we're going to see how this all comes together. So the first pair that we're going to see here are the disease plagues. And so we begin chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. As the contest escalated, God sent upon Egypt the plagues of murrain and boils. From the first of these, the livestock throughout Egypt died. The second affliction fell upon man as well as beast. From both plagues, the land of Goshen was exempt. So, the plague of murrain. All right. Now, some of you farmers might know what that means. I didn't, so I had to look it up. What's murrain? Anybody know? I'll be. Well, see, I thought maybe it was another way of saying livestock. It was if it was plague on the cattle or whatever, it was another word, but it's actually, murrain is an infectious disease afflicting cattle and other animals. So that's what that means. I did not know. I had to look it up, murrain. So it is an infectious disease affecting cattle and other animals. Well, let's look at chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. Would someone read that for me? Anyone? Lynn? Yes, please. All right, interesting. Thank you. All right, so we have this, another interesting phrase here, but the heart of Pharaoh was hardened doesn't indicate an agent of hardening, does it? It's a general statement, right? Okay, so that didn't help us. We'll see here in a little bit. So the fifth plague again began with the freedom demand and a threat. If Pharaoh refused to heed, a terrible disease would afflict the cattle of Egypt the next day. Again, the area of Goshen would be exempt, so it was. Egyptian livestock by the thousands died. Pharaoh, he sent servants to investigate conditions in Goshen and found them just as Moses had predicted. Yet Pharaoh would not release the Israelites. No mention is made of Aaron in this plague, which is interesting. Now, here is something. The first 4 plagues afflicted the people. They were uncomfortable for sure. But those plagues did not impact their property in any major way. But this plague was going to hurt them in the billfold for years to come. So let's think about the culture, the economy of Egypt at this time. What's it going to center around? The economy. The culture and economy, what's it going to center around? Okay, animals. Okay, so it's going to center, the economy. So if you study, I don't know if sociology is the right field, but if you study history and things like that, they kind of divide cultures into different ways they go about producing things, right? So how would you describe this culture as a whole? Were they manufacturing? Yeah, agricultural, right? So most cultures at this time were agricultural. So what's going to be the 2 main things that bring in your crops and your herds, right? That's going to be, now there were other things that they produced well through precious metals and things like that. If you know anything about Egypt, what did they do? They had some pretty shiny stuff, right? But as far as everyday economy and stuff, they were agricultural society. So this is going to hit them hard, really hard. All of their livestock dead. Or was it all? Okay, all the Israelites. So they had theirs, but did all of Pharaoh's cattle die? Mm-hmm. What verse are you in? And all the livestock of Egypt died? Mm-hmm. Okay. So this was going to hurt them for many, many years. Now, the gods of Egypt affected by this plague. Now, the Egyptians, first of all, worshiped many animals and many animal-headed deities. Now, are you guys familiar with hieroglyphics and images? A lot of times, what will you see? You'll see human with different kinds of animal heads, and that's very, very common. So the plague of murrain would affect that just off the bat. They worship Jupiter, Ammon, and a ram, Anubis, and a dog, and Apis, and a bull, and others too, which Egypt admired as symbols of its god. So the Apis bull, a bull deity worshipped in Egypt since around 3000 BC, was the sacred creature of Ptah and worshipped as his living image. So here's something. Now this is fascinating. I think this is fascinating. So the Egyptian priests, when we talk about the Apis bull, when they say they mean the. And so here's what I mean by that. Egyptian priests had to find a special black bull, one that had a white triangle on its forehead with the hair of its tail divided in two separate strands. Okay, so an actual bull that looked this way, they had to find one, the priests. So what does that mean for them when Apis the first dies? What did it mean? They had to go find another one. Yeah, so when the Apis bull died, priests would travel through every pasture in Egypt looking for his replacement. So when this bull that represented this god died, this actual bull, they would have to go look for a black one with a triangle of white hair on its head. What are the chances of finding that in its tail in two separate strands? You think there was ever one of these priests with the little white paint? Like, we've looked everywhere. Pharaoh's going to kill us. Paint a triangle on its head. Its tail split. So they would search. So when the Apis bull died, the land of Egypt mourned for him as they would mourn for the loss of a monarch himself. After death, his body would be embalmed, and after the funeral rites were performed, the body would be placed in a granite sarcophagus. And one of these was discovered in 1851. So, the plague of murrain would be a problem here for them. So by logic, what would have happened? The Apis bull is dead. Now, you're going to find his replacement. They're all dead too. So, well, they could have attempted that, but I mean, just think though about how God is using these things as retribution for what they worshipped. I don't want to use the word sarcasm, but maybe you guys can help me think of a word. It's a very poignant, sharp attack on the things that they believed, showing how hollow they were. So, that was the Apis bull. Now there's others here. Let me get back to that section in the lesson. There was also Hathor, was considered the mother of the Pharaoh and also the sky goddess. She also took the form of a cow with a circle between the horns to represent the sun. There was Montu, the protector of kings during times of war. Montu took the symbol of an ox and was sometimes represented as a human being with the head of an ox. And Khnum, a human being with a ram's head, the creator of the universe with a potter's wheel. So all of these would have been affected by this plague, the plague of murrain. So then we have the plague of boils. Now, as is in the case of the third plague, No direct prediction is recorded prior to the plague of boils. God directed Moses to take handfuls of soot from a furnace and toss them into the air in Pharaoh's presence. That Moses said nothing threatening while performing this action is difficult to imagine. In any case, festering boils broke out on men and animals throughout the land. This plague may have lasted for weeks. The bodies of the magicians were so disfigured that they could no longer appear before Moses. The people suffered more under this plague than any of those which preceded. At this point, for the first time, the text states that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So let's read this. Would someone please read 8 through... Well... Yeah, let's go ahead and read through 17. 8 through 17. Yeah, you got that, Gary? Okay.
The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of soot from the hill, and let Moses throw them in the air in the sight of Pharaoh. They shall become fine dust over all the land of Egypt, and become boils breaking out in stores of man and beast throughout all of Egypt. So they took out soot from the kiln, stood before Pharaoh, and Moses threw it in the air, and it became boils break out in stores of man and beast. And the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils. The boils came upon the magicians, upon all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. He did not listen to them, as the Lord had spoken to Moses. The seventh plague hail. Then the Lord said to Moses, rise up early in the morning and present yourself before Pharaoh and say to him, thus saith the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go, that they may serve me. This time I will send all my plagues on you yourself, and on your servants, and on your people, so that you may know that there is none like me in the earth. By now I could have put out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. For this purpose I have raised you up to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. You are still exalting yourself against my people, and will not let them go.
Okay. So, for the first time, we have where the text states that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. All right, so we have statements that Pharaoh hardened his heart. And then in chapter 9, we have, but the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the people go. And now we have that God hardened his heart. So how do we deal with these statements? Does that mean the Bible is inconsistent? Does it mean that, well, it could mean that it's wrong. It could mean that, that doesn't know, that it can't get its story straight. Or it could mean, if we say that God was the agent behind this all along, that he's the one who hardened Pharaoh's heart. Okay. Okay, so you're saying it's both, that Pharaoh hardened his heart and God hardened Pharaoh's heart? Is that what I hear you saying? Okay, so that's a possibility. So if we have at any point here that we are attributing the hardening of Pharaoh's heart to God's action upon him, are there any issues, philosophical issues with that? Yeah, very, very much in that sense, if we say that God is causing Pharaoh's heart directly through action, imposing upon him certain things, that he is causing it, then what Christian religious system would say, yeah, there's no problem with that? Okay, broader than that. Yeah, Calvinists would say, well, sure, godly decrees all things. So we have no problem with that. But does this lead us down a path here? So if we do remove free will at this point, okay, that's a problem, but there's another problem too. So God removes free will and makes you do something good. Got a problem with that? Yeah. I'm saying hypothetically. Okay, so if we're saying God decrees all things and you do something benevolent, you give $1,000 to someone who needs it. But God's the author and cause of that. Set aside the free will issue. Do you have a problem with that? I said set aside the free will. We're coming from a Calvinist perspective that says that God decrees all things. He's sovereign and decrees everything. So He's the one that's causing that. So you're doing something good. No problem, right? Set aside free will. Work with me. No problem, right? Okay, now flip it. What if Pharaoh does something sinful? You got a problem with that? See, that's where I'm saying how do we justify that? So if you want to remove free will from it, that's fine, and you want to say the good things that come of that, but we find over and over again that Pharaoh sinned. And in fact, at the end of lesson 5, we're going to find out that he's a type, we're going to discuss the fact that he's a type of Satan himself. A foreshadowing that there's examples and things of Pharaoh that actually are true of Satan himself. So, we do have a problem with the fact that free will is removed, but we also have a problem that if God, in fact, is the one that hardened Pharaoh's heart, then God is ultimately responsible for the sins that result from that hardening. Who's willing to say that? Question? Did he? Pharaoh wrote this? When did Pharaoh acknowledge?
Is that why God hardened his heart? Is it because Pharaoh acknowledged that God set in
The plagues? I don't know.
You understand what I'm saying? Because before it was because of Pharaoh.
Well, plague 2, the frogs, he was...
Up to that point, maybe he didn't acknowledge it was God. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes and no. I think I understand what you're saying, and if I understand what you're saying, I don't know if it's philosophically solid position. Go ahead. According to who? According to what worldview? I'm sorry? Okay, so right and wrong within the Egyptian worldview may not necessarily be right and wrong according to God's perspective. So I think I understand what you're saying. Ultimately, we all have kind of an intuition as to what's ultimately right and wrong. You're on the right track for sure. So, two things I want to bring. You've got it here in your notes in Lesson 5. I've provided you with an article. It's titled, Who Hardened Pharaoh's Heart? Now, these are gentlemen that are part of an organization called Apologetic Press. Anybody heard of that? Okay. Apologetic Press is a website that is very much, they cover all sorts of apologetic issues. And they are a Church of Christ organization. Church of Christ non-instrumental organization. So there's a lot of great stuff on there, and you'll wonder why we've never heard of these folks, like at different things that we go to, is because they believe the music is a test of fellowship, so they choose not to fellowship within the Restoration movement with those who are instrumental. So Hillsboro, things like that, you're not going to find their materials, most likely. You're not going to find an apologetic press table set up at winter worship and things like that. However, that being said, set aside the non-instrumental thing aside from it, they have a ton of great materials that speak on very closely to what we believe. So we are going to set out here. There's quite a bit of setup here in this article, and that gets us to the point of understanding where we're at in this, in what's being said about Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. That's the statements we've got so far, right? So how are we going to figure all this out? Well, I'm going to let you read the first section of this, and on the middle of page 2, you'll see a paragraph that starts with 2 excellent explanations. You see that? Okay, that's where we're going to start. So 2 excellent explanations are available that account for the Exodus declarations, each perfectly plausible and sufficient to demonstrate that both the skeptic and Calvinist interpretations are incorrect. So the skeptic says what? The skeptic, they see these different statements, say what? Bible's wrong, it's inconsistent. See, these are inconsistencies. So that's refuting the skeptic, and the Calvinist says, yes, that's fine. We don't have a problem with it. God decreed it. So we can't accept either one of those positions, can we? Okay, so these excellent explanations deal with both of these misunderstandings. Both explanations pertain to the fact that every language has its own way of using certain types of words and phrases that might appear odd to a person not familiar with the language. For instance, suppose a person commented that his boss became angry and bit his head off. Now, we have a lot of sayings like this, don't we? Well, when we read that 10,000 years from now, just saying, oh my word. Right? If you didn't understand the colloquial sayings, the things that were involved in that, would anyone think that the speaker actually had bitten his head off? Of course not. English-speaking people understand this example of figurative speech. Or suppose a person went looking for a job and someone said that she was hitting the streets. She was not literally hitting the streets with her fist. Most English speakers would understand the idiom. In the same way, the biblical language had idioms, colloquialisms, Semitisms, and word usages peculiar to them, which those familiar with the language would understand. So in his copious work on biblical figures of speech, E.W. Bollinger listed several ways that the Hebrew and Greek languages use verbs to mean something other than their strict literal usage. He listed several verses to show that the languages use active verbs to express the agent's design or attempt to do anything, even though the thing was not actually done. To illustrate, in discussing the Israelites in Deuteronomy 28:68 says, "Ye shall be sold, put up for sale, unto your enemies, and no man shall buy you." The translators of the New King James Version recognized the idiom and rendered the verse, "You shall be offered for sale." The text clearly indicated that they would not be sold because there would be no buyer, yet the Hebrew active verse for sold was used. In the New Testament, a clear example of this type of usage is found in 1 John 1:10, which states, "If we say that we have not sinned, we make him, God, a liar." No one can make God a liar, but the attempt to deny sin is the equivalent of attempting to make God a liar, which is rendered as an active verb, as if actually happened. Verbs, therefore, can have idiomatic usages that may convey something other than a strict literal meaning. Now, this is all fairly technical. And in fact, the next paragraph goes into more details and examples. Now, let's move down to the next paragraph that says, a second equally legitimate explanation for the Exodus text is that the allusions to God hardening Pharaoh's heart are a form of figurative speech fairly closely associated with metaphor, known as metonymy, where one name or word is employed for another. For example, when we speak of reading Shakespeare, we mean that we read his writings or plays. God hardening Pharaoh's heart would be metonymy of the subject, that is, the subject is announced, while some property or circumstance belonging to it is meant. Specifically, under this form of figure, An action is sometimes said to have been accomplished when all that is meant by it is the occasion was given. So there's examples of this, and you can do some more study and reading on this. And so I want you to take some time and do that. Now, the second to last paragraph on page 4 says this: in the case of Pharaoh, God hardened Pharaoh's heart in the sense that God provided the circumstances and the occasion for Pharaoh to be forced to make a decision. If you have anything at all in this whole thing that you read, underline that. Did God set up a circumstance where Pharaoh was forced to make a choice? Absolutely. Exactly. God provided the circumstances and the occasion for Pharaoh to be forced to make a decision. Now, think of that for just a second. What all went into God working in these circumstances all coming together that led up to Pharaoh's decisions? All right, hold on now. I'm going to say that again. So, God provided the circumstances and the occasion. Okay, the circumstances and the occasion, everything that led up to that first plague where Pharaoh was forced to make a decision, let my people go, yes or no, what all went into that from God's preparation and providence? 80. Yeah. Think of all the things that were orchestrated that led up to that moment where Pharaoh had to make a choice. You talk about God's power and providence in action. Now, when he's forced to make a choice, Pharaoh still has a choice to make. God knows what the outcome of it is going to be, but he still provides the choice. God sent Moses to place his demands before Pharaoh. Moses merely announced God's instructions. God even accomplished his word with miracles to confirm the divine origin of the message. Pharaoh made up his own mind to resist God's demands. Of his own accord, he stubbornly refused to comply. Of course, God provided the occasion for Pharaoh to demonstrate his unyielding attitude. Okay, so there's another reason why all this. Why 10? Why not 3 or 4? Why not 2? Why 10? I mean, really? Do we have to go through? Do we really have to go through every single one of these? What's it say? Now, is that ESV? Okay, so if you want to think of it from those terms, if you want to get a little bit into that, but the reason that everything's carried out here, now think about this. In the New American Standard, I prefer, ESV is a great translation, no knock against it, but I really prefer the way that 16 is worded in the New American Standard. It says this: "But indeed, for this cause I have allowed you to remain, in order to show you or my power." Now, yours said, it has raised you up. Okay, so raised you up, allowed you to remain. One sounds, now it doesn't mean that how did he go about raising him up? You could say the how is by allowing you to remain. Because allowing you to remain means what? I'm going to put other choices in front of you. And your heart is continuing to be hardened through your own choices. I know what you're going to, now God's omniscient. Now, we're not omniscient, but we can most times, if you're a good understanding of people, you can most times predict what's going to happen if a certain choice is put before certain people, right? If you put a Reese cup in front of me, I'm probably going to eat it. I'm going to eat it. Okay, so, but you understand what I'm saying. Now, you tie omniscience to it, then it's a no-brainer. God knows what's going to happen in the free will decisions of man. So he puts another opportunity in front. Now, in this case, the reason that there was a complete 10 in what eventually happened was for what purpose? So that God's name would be glorified and proclaimed through all the earth. Because did this have ramifications outside of Egypt? Oh, man. When the Israelites are traveling, when they come across, what happens to some of the people they come across? They know what's happened. Some they heard, and we know what happened. Down the line, these things had repercussions throughout history. Did it have repercussions for the Israelites themselves down through the years? Now, here's something else we'll talk about. This ought to make the hair on your arm stand up. The Passover. The Passover would not have had occurred had he not allowed for 10. The Passover have any meaning for us as Christians? Whew. The Passover lamb. John saying, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." If God had not permitted all 10 here, that would have no meaning. Okay, so, of his own accord, he stubbornly refused to apply. Of course, God provided the occasion for Pharaoh to demonstrate his unyielding attitude. If God had not sent Moses, Pharaoh would not have been faced with the dilemma of whether to release the Israelites. So God was certainly the instigator and initiator, but he was not the author of Pharaoh's defiance. Notice that in a very real sense, all 4 of the following statements are true. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Moses hardened Pharaoh's heart. The words that Moses spoke hardened Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh hardened his own heart. All 4 of these observations are accurate, depicting the same truth from different perspectives. In this sense, God is responsible for everything in the universe. He has provided the occasion, the circumstances, and the environment in which all things, including people, operate. But he is not guilty of wrong in so doing. For a quick look at simple Hebrew idiom, it is clear that God did not unjustly or directly harden Pharaoh's heart. There's some more there that you can read. All right, does this help? Do you think this is a solid understanding of this? I really do. Now, we blitz through a lot of this, but I mean, really here the conclusions and the way that they read I think are extremely solid understandings of this. And then when you understand the Hebrew language itself, we can be comfortable in saying that God permitted and provided the circumstances and the occasion for Pharaoh to be forced to make a decision. All right, any questions about that? So, we will pick up with, we're still in the middle of the plague of boils. We will finish that plague and some other things that are tied to that. But that's the first time that phrase pops up, that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And I wanted to deal with that because we started into it a little bit. Then we will move into the destruction plagues, the 7th and 8th, and the darkness plagues, 9 and 10, and then what happens after that. All right, any questions or comments? Clear as mud? Hopefully clear in mud. Questions or comments? So now you can rest easy knowing what it means when it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart.